Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the annual CNAS National Security Conference. I'm Becca Wasser, a senior fellow in the defense program here at the Center for New American Security. I'm so pleased that you could join us today for what is going to be a fantastic panel on opportunities within trilateral relations among Japan, South Korea, and the United States. In 2022, Japan and South Korea began to pursue sort of nascent rapprochement after years of bitter disputes that were built on historical tensions. Relations between Tokyo and Seoul have been on a rather positive trajectory for almost a year now, and it seems perhaps that cooperation rather than tension may again be the predominant dynamic between the two countries, who both happen to be some of the United States' most important allies in the region. And this creates an opportunity for renewed cooperation, not only between Japan and South Korea, but also with the United States. As CNAS research, but led by two of our panelists today, has shown, deepening trilateral cooperation would enhance stability and growth in Asia and also ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. We've seen nascent steps during this renewed engagement in three core areas of cooperation: diplomacy, security, and technology. But more needs to be done in order to create consistent engagement and to enable the three democratic nations to build coordinated responses to the diplomatic, security, and technology challenges that they face. For Washington, these efforts would be in line with the aims of the U.S. national security strategy and the concept of integrated deterrence. But as I've written with my colleague Stacey Pettyjohn in a recent CNAS report about integrated deterrence with allies and partners, true integration is an incredibly high standard to achieve. And it's even more complicated when you consider the fact that we've been here before with Japan and South Korea. And that means that perhaps some of the recently restored relations could quickly turn sour at any given moment. So this means we need to be thinking about ways to seize on this current opportunity to create lasting gains, even if relations end up stumbling and faltering. And this is exactly what today's panel is trying to do: identify the opportunities for trilateral engagement. I'm joined today by three esteemed panelists, all of whom I am so incredibly lucky to work with every single day. First, we have Josh Fitt, who is an associate fellow in our Indo-Pacific Security Program, who's going to tackle some of the diplomatic relations and dimensions of the trilateral relationship. Next, we have Hannah Kelly, who's a research assistant in our technology program, who's going to focus on more of the technical and technological elements. And lastly, we have Jake Stokes, who is a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific Security Program, who's going to handle the security dimensions of this relationship. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. The way this panel is going to work is that I'm first going to have a brief conversation with the three panelists, almost like a quick round robin Q&A, if you will. But I'm then going to turn to the audience for their questions, which our panelists are going to answer. That's the fun part of this event. So you can ask these questions on cnas.org/live by using the text box that's under the video player, or you could ask questions on Twitter by using hashtag CNAS2023. And we only have a short amount of time for this panel, which means you should probably be inputting questions throughout. So they're ready to go as soon as we are ready to go. We'll be at the Q&A before you know it. We're also going to go through the questions at lightning speed. So it would be great if you could tag who the question is for. Josh for political and diplomatic questions, Hannah for tech-related issues, and Jake for some of your security questions. And that's going to help us get to more. So without further ado, let us kick this panel off. All right, I'm going to start with Josh. Josh, I'm wondering if you can maybe baseline us a little bit. Could you briefly explain how it is that we got here? Politically speaking, what needed to be overcome in both Tokyo and Seoul to make this happen?
Sure. Thanks, Becca. First of all, it's really great to be here with the three of you as we carry the momentum through the final day of the annual conference. I'm really looking forward to seeing the finale of the pitch at the conclusion of our session a little after 2:30. So I just want to start off by echoing this point that it's a truly exciting time in the US-ROK U.S.-Japan-ROK trilateral relations. Of course, there are still skeptics of the trilateral, but I think compared to a year ago, there's a strong feeling in Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington that there's a real potential for things to get back to where they were pre-2018 when relations soured, and even go further than that as well. Historically, the trilateral has been pushed closer in response to discrete provocations from North Korea. But as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Eli Ratner mentioned in a fireside chat earlier today with our program director, Lisa Curtis, the United States and its two allies are now boldly saying that a functioning trilateral relationship is important for regional stability and ought to be sustained just as a matter of course and not just when there's a discrete threat from North Korea. So to answer your question, I think one piece of what brought us here is that there's new leadership in Seoul and Tokyo, which was a chance to reset the dynamic of bilateral Japan-ROK relations. The strategy advanced by the Yoon administration in Seoul focuses much more heavily on advancing Korea as a major player in the region and not just focusing on peninsular issues vis-a-vis North Korea. And ultimately, Yoon is striving towards transforming South Korea into what he dubs a global pivotal state. And Yoon has essentially recognized that the best way to achieve this is through relationships with its foremost ally, the United States, and as well as like-minded democracies, including Japan. Japan as well, the new Prime Minister Kishida Fumio has also worked to carry on the essentially the legacy of the Abe administration in terms of pursuing networks with other like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific, leveraging its alliance with the United States, but also pursuing opportunities with other countries to leverage their comparative advantages as well. And of course, Korea, as one of Japan's closest neighbors, is an essential piece of this. I also think, in addition to the new leadership in those capitals, the United States acted as a facilitator in sort of bringing the parties together, not necessarily inserting itself into the middle of a historical dispute, but rather reminding both sides of the stakes and ultimately the opportunities of greater trilateral relations. But perhaps most of all, I think it was a realization in both Seoul and Tokyo that the threat environment in the Indo-Pacific and particularly in Northeast Asia is rapidly deteriorating due to an increased aggression from China and North Korea. But for more on that, I will leave it to my colleague Jake to discuss that security and defense aspect of things.
Josh, thank you so much for that. That's incredibly helpful to me as a non-expert to really understand the background, and I'm sure it's super helpful for our audience as well. You gave a great segue into us talking to Jake and asking him a few questions about the security dimension. I think traditionally, one of the things that we've found, in sort of state-to-state relations is that even when there are tensions, it's usually the military to military relationships that continue, even when things are politically difficult. Has that been the case with South Korea and Japan? If so, what are some of the most common forms of security cooperation between those two nations? Have they endured even at some of the low points in the relationship?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Becca. And it's great to be here with you, Hannah, and Josh to talk about such an important issue. And I think, if anything, it's kind of understudied as all of this focus in U.S. and increasingly global policy looking at the Indo-Pacific. This is such a critical relationship. I think in order to understand where the Japan-ROK defense relationship is today, we actually have to take a step back and consider its recent low point. And that was a December 2018 incident where Japan alleges that a South Korean Navy destroyer locked its fire control radar on a Japanese P-1 patrol aircraft. Of course, Seoul disputes this characterization of events, But generally speaking, locking a fire control radar is sort of the last step before firing, and so seen as pretty escalatory. So that was kind of seen as the recent low point and really embodied the deep lack of trust between the two states. And to your point, or to your question, that had filtered down even to the military operational level in some pretty unfortunate ways. Since then, as Josh has mentioned, leadership in both countries has changed in really important ways. And President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida have improved the relationship across nearly every area, and this includes the military sphere. And a lot of it is driven by those deepening threat perceptions from North Korea, China, and to a lesser extent, Russia. And I think in this context, we've seen a pretty swift set of activities that indicate the deepening and improving military relationships, both bilaterally but also trilaterally with the U.S. So we saw the leaders from the three countries meet on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Madrid last June. In March of this year, South Korea's foreign ministry announced that it would normalize what's known as the General Security of Military Information Agreement, or GSOMIA, which is a vital military intelligence sharing pact with Japan that had been suspended back in 2019. In April, we saw the first trilateral embark on board a U.S. ballistic missile submarine involving senior commanders of the submarine fleets of the three nations, so an important area for operational cooperation. Also in April, at the higher official level, we saw the three powers revise their defense trilateral talks at the Assistant Secretary or Director General levels, and that was between Japan, the ROK, and the United States. And they've already agreed to hold the next round, so it shows some kind of faith in where this process is going. And importantly, that was followed closely by Japan and South Korea themselves holding their own bilateral security talks for the first time in 5 years, quite a long time. And those included both the defense and foreign ministry officials in what we would call kind of a 2+2 somewhat format. And then we've seen a couple major trilateral exercises this year, including a ballistic missile defense drill back in February and an anti-submarine exercise back in April. So again, seeing that operational integration. And then finally, the country's defense ministers just met in Singapore on the margins of the Shangri-La dialogue. And that was the first meeting of the two countries' defense ministers since the fall of 2019. So many years with lots of events intervening. And there they agreed to advance cooperation between their defense authorities broadly, and also agreed to speed up working level talks on pending issues, including what they're going to do to prevent another radar lock incident that, as I said earlier, derailed ties, or was a major factor in derailing ties a few years ago. So as you can see, there's a lot going on in the defense and security space, which is particularly indicative both of the improvement in relations between Tokyo and Seoul, but also that deteriorating security environment in Northeast Asia.
Well, there most certainly is a lot going on there. And I wonder if there's that kind of energy on a different side of the relationship, which is looking more at the tech side. These are two economic and technological powerhouses, specifically in some core areas, including semiconductors, which Hannah and I have written about together. So Hannah, I'd like to ask you, since the thawing of ties between Japan and South Korea, have we seen a shift, any sort of tangible steps toward greater technological cooperation? And if so, which core areas are those happening in?
Sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and everyone watching remotely. Yes, to answer your question, bottom line is yes. The recent thawing has already had substantial impacts on tech issues between the two states, and I think holds potential for even greater cooperation in the coming months if this new momentum is really harnessed. We see this shift especially with recent developments surrounding Japan's 2019 export controls on key chemicals, which South Korean companies need to manufacture semiconductors and displays. This was a real pain point in the country's tech relationship, after which South Korea filed a complaint with the WTO, and both states downgraded each other's trade statuses. But more recently, in March, Japan dropped these export controls and South Korea dropped the WTO complaint. And South Korea has also since restored Japan's status as a preferred trading partner, and Japan's taking steps to do the same. So we're really starting to see that irritant be lifted from the relationship, which I think is really critical in kickstarting increased dialogue, especially when it comes to tech issues. Just last month, President Yoon met with Japanese business leaders and encouraged increased tech cooperation between the two states. And Prime Minister Kishida met with leaders from various top semiconductor companies, including Korea's Samsung, which is considering building a chip facility near Tokyo, and there's talk of potential Japanese subsidies to help get that off the ground. So again, just really positive movement happening, both at sort of the regulatory level, but then also engaging industry in both states. And as Jake mentioned, top leadership have met on a number of occasions in recent months, but also in recent weeks, including on the margins of the G7, to discuss shared challenges that the two states face, including the North Korea threat and Chinese movement, more assertive movement towards both states, but also to reflect on some of the aligned interests when it comes to discrete tech topics. And so as Becca, you mentioned, semiconductors is obviously at the fore given the strength of these two countries in that sector. Both countries are part of the CHIPS 4 partnership, so there's sort of a platform for dialogue in that vein, along with the US and Taiwan. Batteries and electrical vehicles are also an area that is of interest for these two states. And then, of course, supply chain resiliency more broadly, given all the disruptions that we've seen in recent years and the need for more collaboration to really shore up critical technology supply chains. And technology cooperation is by nature an investment in longer-term relations. We know this from the semiconductor supply chain disruptions, just how interconnected the technology sector is and how interconnected technology partners are. And so entering into deeper tech cooperation at this point is really rarely done casually. South Korea is a leader in manufacturing technologies, and Japan is a leader in materials and equipment and components. There will always be healthy points of competition between the two countries and between their disparate tech sectors. But there's also many points for potential cooperation given shared interests and complementary strengths. And so I think we're really starting to see that potential for being really a powerhouse together coming to the fore in the last year.
I mean, you're leaving us on such a positive note. You know, me being a little bit of a pessimist, I hope that we get at some of those more competitive elements, ideally in some of the questions that we're going to be receiving from the audience. Speaking of which, I see some great questions coming in already, but I'm greedy, so I would like more. So please, please, please keep the positive momentum going and keep sending us your questions. A reminder that you can use cnas.org/live, or you could use hashtag CNAS2023 on Twitter. Okay, now we're going to move to sort of the quick round robin part of this panel, which is I'm going to ask a panel to all three panelists, and they're going to answer pretty quickly. So for all three of you, which areas of cooperation do you think hold the greatest promise for deeper trilateral engagement? And specifically, what would you like to see as the next step in this relationship? Josh, let's start with you.
Thanks, Becca. I'll try to be as quick as I can. So yeah, as Jake mentioned, there's been a great deal of progress in terms of trilateral diplomacy at the leader level, the ministerial level, vice ministerial level, et cetera. I think that's important, and I applaud these diplomatic overtures, and that's really the backbone of identifying, enabling, and sustaining areas of cooperation. But to answer your question, I think sort of paradoxically, one area that holds the greatest promise, in my view, for deeper trilateral engagement is the Quad. That might be a strange answer because it's the Quad is the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. You may have noticed South Korea is not on that list, and there are a couple additional countries outside of this trilateral relationship that are. But I think the Quad holds great promise because I think what the trilateral relationship ultimately suffers from is an agenda issue. Critically, through the meetings I mentioned earlier and Jake mentioned earlier, the United States, Japan, and Korea have laid out their common vision for their relations with each other and for broader rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. But I think a vision without initiatives lacks an agenda. And so in just a few short years, the Quad has emerged as the focal point of multilateral collaboration in the Indo-Pacific, and it's a central pillar of the Biden administration's regional strategy. and overall just a major force for good in the region. Premised on like leveraging the comparative advantages of its members as liberal democracies. So I think like this is an area where Korea has indicated that they're interested in becoming more involved along all the different, or several of the different working groups and pillars of the Quad. However, I think the Quad is rightfully hesitant to expand formally at this stage because it's essentially launching its own implementation phase right now anyway. But there are still areas where a highly capable, like-minded Indo-Pacific democracy such as South Korea could plug in.
That's super interesting, Josh. I think there's an open question now, given the push for all of these different minilateral groupings. Is the answer to create more minilaterals or to expand some of the existing minilaterals? And I think we're going to see where that might shake out in the next year or so, and perhaps even after that. Hannah, let's go to you. What do you see on the tech side? What do you think is the area that holds the greatest promise for greater cooperation?
Sure. So I think first I'm going to provide a probably pretty tired analogy, but I find it useful in my own research. If we think of the trilateral relationship like a stool, right now the Japan-US leg of the stool is pretty strong. The ROK U.S. leg of the stool is pretty strong. I think it's all fair for us to say that the current weakest leg of the stool is that Japan-ROK relationship. And I think when it comes to trilateral tech cooperation, it's important that all three legs of the stool are strong and that communication channels are open and honest and productive in all three communication stool legs or channels, whatever you want to call them. And so as far as just what's needed to really push this forward, I think strengthening that particular relationship between the two states is critical. We've seen a lot of improvement in recent months, but we're already seeing talks of increased Japan-ROK cooperation on the tech front, which could really be a springboard for more concrete strategic alignment in the two other areas as well. I think what's really interesting about technology policy writ large, and we see this in the United States, it being a bipartisan issue in the United States, it's certainly something that Democratic allies and partners often can come to the table and have constructive conversations about, just because it's recognized as this key indicator of global power moving forward. And it's also very obvious that with so many different players moving in the space, there needs to be some sort of cooperation and collaboration to make sure that the rules of the road are set by those that we want to be setting them when it comes to norms and standards. As I mentioned earlier, there is already interest in coordinating more on semiconductors, batteries, electrical vehicles, et cetera. But the South Korean Vice Minister of Science and ICT also recently spoke about how the ROK is considering expanding cooperation with Japan in sectors like AI and 5G and 6G wireless networks and space and quantum technologies. And so I think there's an appetite to really stretch the relationship's legs in terms of specific tech sectors that they can cooperate on. But as Josh mentioned, concrete agendas and initiatives matter to see what that's going to look like in practice with industries that might have competing interests, with differing relationships with third party and third country players in these tech spaces. It's really going to be difficult to tell how successful that further cooperation will be until we really start to see actions being taken. I think one thing that's really key, though, is the issue of tech talent, which cuts across all sectors and is of particular concern in both Japan and South Korea, given that both countries are facing demographic challenges with aging societies. And so I think one thing that they could really collaborate on in the near term is fostering talent exchanges and STEM outreach programs to get at some of those more complex demographic issues in the near term, and not end up behind in different tech conversations because of that sort of cleavage. And by leveraging both states' existing tech talent and really pushing to foster that of future generations, I think that's kind of the best place that they can really push to maintain their respective technical advantages. Again, in strengthening their bilateral relationship, but to the benefit of the trilateral relationship. So again, in addition to collaborating on discrete tech sector issues, I think the issue of critical tech talent is really ripe for cooperation for these two players.
And that's also something that we've heard a ton about recently in the U.S. context, specifically when we've been talking about the CHIPS Act and ways to strengthen some of U.S. competitiveness in the tech domain. Jake, what about you? What do you see in the security domain?
Yeah, well, let me just share kind of two near-term goals or opportunities and two that might be a little bit more of a stretch. So we already see the three partners, Japan, ROK, and the US, are working to activate a data sharing mechanism to exchange real-time missile warning data, ideally before the end of the year. And so that's a really important near-term step. But you could envision adding on things in that space related to maritime and space domain awareness that could be fruitful and would be of interest to all three countries in the pretty immediate future. Second, I think there's probably opportunities for additional bilateral military engagement to help build trust between Japan and the ROK, even without the United States in the room. So Josh and I were in Japan last week, and we heard some rumors that we might see bilateral exercises or patrols in the coming weeks or months, although nothing's been announced yet. So we'll have our eyes peeled for those for sure. So those are the two kind of nearer term. I think there's two more that could be a little bit more of a stretch. I think we could see Japan and the ROK conducting more consultations about potential contingencies, even if it's not quite to the level of contingency planning. And of course, those would be related to contingencies around North Korea, around Taiwan, and they might even exchange views along with the United States on some extended deterrence issues, including some of the nuclear components. We've seen recently the establishment of the U.S.-South Korea Nuclear Consultative Group, which came out of President Yoon's summit here in Washington with President Biden. And that has really important overlap with the longstanding U.S.-Japan extended deterrence dialogue that's been ongoing since 2010, although at a slightly lower rank level and more quietly. Of course, the national context and views on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence are quite different between the two countries, so it would really have to start slowly, but there's potentially some value there. Finally, I think there's actually a range of longer-term consultations on practical military issues that both countries face. So here, thinking about how to respond to gray zone pressure from China, improving integrated air and missile defenses, for a range of threats, effectively integrating emerging technologies such as uncrewed systems and AI into their joint forces. And then finally, relating to the demographic decline that was mentioned earlier, addressing some of the military personnel challenges that such a steep demographic decline will present to both sides. So those are a few of the areas that we might build on this relationship going forward.
That's super interesting, and thanks for splitting it down into sort of two different time frames, if you will. I think, in some ways, you've pulled the thread together across all of these different areas, and it goes back to Jake, right? The sort of political part, to Josh, some of the political part, the historical mistrust can actually stymie some of the tech cooperation as well as some of the defense cooperation. Integrated air and missile defense is a really high bar to achieve because the integration requires sharing really sensitive information and data, and states that often have tensions find that to be a little bit difficult to get to. So this brings us to the audience Q&A, and the first question dovetails quite nicely. So this one is for Josh. And Chaz asks the really important question of, are you concerned that the historic alienation between the two countries will contribute to mistrust that might jeopardize the alliance in times of immense stress, such as a potential invasion of Taiwan?
Thanks for the question, Chaz. In short, yes, I think that is a concern. And, that's something that we've seen over the past 4 years. If that had happened in the time of great need, such as a Taiwan contingency, I think that is a great concern. However, to your point, I think that that's why it is so important right now, when there is positive momentum in the trilateral relationship, to solidify the progress on institutionalization, building out mechanisms on the defense, technology, diplomatic spheres that would withstand relationship turbulence when something like this eventually comes, which obviously I hope never would. But having essentially having the reps in a time such as now is what would be critical to having things go smoothly in a situation like what you've described.
Yeah. Oh, we're getting so many questions coming in. Now I have to decide and start choosing who gets what. Okay. I think this question is probably best posed to Hannah. And Mark asks, what role has a shared threat perception of adversaries played in getting Japan and Korea to cooperate on tech issues? That's a great question, Mark. So Hannah, really interested to hear what your response is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as has already been mentioned in this panel, the North Korea threat has really, I think, spurred this conversation to the fore perhaps earlier than it would have, as far as encouraging both states to start to thaw the tension that was existing. I think at the same time, there is this shared understanding of this increasing threat when it comes to China. And characterizing that threat might look differently between the two states in some ways, as South Korean industry is still very much wrapped up in Chinese markets, as are some Japanese assets, as are some U.S. assets. So there is sort of this tension between economic interests and this threat perception. But I think this sort of shared understanding of who's moving around us, what are they moving on, and do we want those who are moving the fastest to be in charge of setting the rules for the road? I think we see this a lot when we look at the Russian war in Ukraine. We see this with North Korea. We see this especially with China. China is moving extremely fast in certain technology areas. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily the leaders in those technology areas yet, but they're really trying to catch up. One example that comes to mind is artificial intelligence. They're really pushing with artificial intelligence right now. And the potential for China setting the rules of the road for artificial intelligence is concerning given how they are already leveraging capabilities that exist in their mass surveillance, in their oppression state, and how they're exporting those capabilities to other states. That is really concerning. And I think given that both Japan and South Korea are in the neighborhood and they're watching that sort of happen before their eyes while they're tracking their own interests and being leaders in those critical technology sectors, I think there's also a shared understanding that we have to get over some of these speed bumps in our relationship so that we can be sitting on the same side of the table, writing rules for these technology sectors that we really want to be leaders in, and we really want to be involved in the global economy when it comes to these technology sectors. But if we're too busy sort of struggling on the side, that conversation is going to pass us by. And I think they want to be a part of that conversation, and both have shown long-standing positive relationships with the United States, but even recently their relationships with the United States, I think, have been strengthening too. And I think that also comes back to wanting to be on a certain side of the table when it comes to technology use. So hopefully that answers the question.
Fantastic response. I see that we've got a defense question, so I think that means that, Jake, you're about to be up. And I think that we might have some navalists in the audience based on this one. So this is from Sean for Jake, and he asks, is the recent announcement of a South Korean carrier an indicator of a broader defense shift and possible deeper cooperation with Japan that is to come?
Yeah, there's always this question, I think, about what capabilities mean for intentions. I mean, as Josh mentioned earlier, there is a push by the Yoon administration to sort of think beyond the peninsula in terms of Korea's interests, and some of that is going to apply in the security sector as well. I think there is ultimately a balance about, given the real and very severe threat from North Korea, about what those kinds of capabilities, especially very expensive ones like aircraft carriers, how much they apply to South Korea's security situation in particular. But I think in general, as a power projection type capability, it implies a desire to have a broader regional presence. And I think that definitely opens up more capabilities to or possibilities to potentially exercise bilaterally with Japan, trilaterally, and also joining a broader set of multilateral exercises that you're seeing really across the Indo-Pacific, whether very, very broad U.S. led ones like the Rim of the Pacific exercises, and some of the more narrower configurations that you see, really on a somewhat continuous basis throughout the Indo-Pacific. So I think in many ways it suggests a Korean ambition to plug into a network security architecture in the region, and Japan would be a natural node for that, especially as relations improve.
I mean, that definitely sounds like integrated deterrence in real time to me. We've got this great question from Sherry that seems to be marrying up both the political scene in Asia with the U.S. domestic scene. So Josh, this one's going to go to you. Sherry asks, to what extent does the uncertainty of future U.S. leadership play a role in the effort to strengthen this trilateral relationship?
Thanks for the question. Definitely an important aspect of this dynamic. I think it's interesting to note that while we also have this challenge, perhaps in the United States, one of the greatest sources of distrust in Tokyo is the concern that whoever succeeds President Yoon in Korea in 2027 would undo any progress similar to when Yoon's predecessor undid a bilateral agreement signed during his predecessor's tenure, President Park. So in one sense, I think just this is a reality of democracies that choose their leaders. Opinions on some issues can swing back and forth like a pendulum and overcorrect. But ultimately, this entire rapprochement between South Korea and Japan has been politically risky. And the extent to which it has succeeded so far is due to the bold steps taken by both leaders. I think that going forward, both Tokyo and Seoul will need to continue to demonstrate the value of a stronger relationship with their counterpart to their own domestic populations who may be quite skeptical, whether that's due to mistrust or looking at the past 4 years of bilateral relations and thinking it wasn't so bad, or even thinking that the bilateral relationship with the United States is sufficient. To some degree, that baseline understanding that the trilateral is important has been established already in Japan and South Korea. And I've seen polling that indicates a desire for stronger relations, even defense relations with each other. But in the same stroke, a strong disapproval of some of the specific tactics that may have been employed by leadership. So if these overarching changes to Japan-Korea relations are to last, they ultimately need to be supported by the people. Now, to get to your question, I think a similar issue facing the United States is the duty of the leadership of the country to convince the public and to show the public that these things are worth pursuing. They're worth American tax dollars. They're worth other commitments. So I think in the remaining years of the Biden administration and just generally as think tankers and policy analysts, these are things that we need to also think about in terms of, talking about this agenda more broadly. But lastly, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is something that U.S. allies are thinking about themselves. One further data point is in the U.S.-Japan alliance specifically, Japan released its 3 major strategy documents last year, which really signaled an evolution of its thinking on foreign and defense policy. And if Jake would forgive me for talking a bit on the defense side of things, one of the major aspects of those documents is Japan's commitment to acquiring counter-strike capability, which is a new thing for Japan. Given Japan's pacifist constitution, there are many limitations on the sorts of military capabilities it's able to have. So as Jake mentioned, we were just in Japan last week, and one of the things that we were interested in learning about was whether this is a reaction, essentially a hedging behavior from Japan. Being concerned about whether a more isolationist American leader would essentially create a greater need for Japan to defend itself without the United States' help. And while that may be true to an extent, I think actually the broader shift signals this desire from Japan to demonstrate its own capability and its own value to the United States. And in doing so, perhaps preempt some of the arguments that would be put forward by some of these potential future leaders of our country here in Washington. Thanks.
I think that's such an important point about allies' perceptions, because I think that's often something that we in Washington forget. Jake, I was wondering if I could ask you to respond to the same question. You know, you've worked in U.S. politics, both at the White House and on the Hill. So I'm wondering if you've got a slightly different take on the linkage between U.S. domestic politics and regional politics when it comes down to this trilateral.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, when we talk to interlocutors in Seoul and Tokyo, the concern about, frankly, abandonment, or at least a more isolationist policy, is real. I think it was much more forward and direct with South Korea under the Trump administration. The Trump administration, or Japan, managed relations with the United States under the Trump administration a little bit better, but I think they watched relations with South Korea with a lot of apprehension at the same time. But I think Josh made a good point when he said that, you know, the response has really been twofold, right? On one hand, in both South Korea and Japan, improve their capabilities to strengthen the alliance and take away some of those arguments that allies are free riders in the system. While also, if you know, some future political development meant that they didn't have the support of the United States, or at least not to the extent that they needed, they would be in a better position to defend themselves. But I think it also suggests something about both states' ambitions to improve relations with each other and to plug in with a broader security network that isn't totally reliant on the United States. The United States is a critical player, but it's not the only hub or only link kind of in the security chain in East Asia. So in that sense, the things Japan and Korea are doing to respond to this potential in American politics are ultimately fairly healthy, I would argue. But I would also say, just from a U.S. politics perspective, that one of the things that's important to understand about how American strategists see our position forward in Asia is that it's not about the security of Japan or Korea in its own right. It's about a U.S. grand strategy for protecting our own national security. And I think leaders in both parties need to make that argument more directly, and that would, I think, reduce some of the idea that you know, the U.S. forward presence in Asia is somehow at the expense of the United States, because it's actually quite the opposite. And I would say, broadly speaking, what you saw during the Trump administration and the way that Congress specifically restrained the president's intention to reduce, or potential intention to reduce, the number of forces on the Korean Peninsula, shows that there's actually a pretty broad consensus that U.S. presence in East Asia is critical to the security not only of that region, but of the United States itself and the security of the global system more broadly.
Okay, we are starting to run short on time, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question, because as I warned before, I can't let us end on a positive note. So let's add a healthy dose of realism into this panel. Since we are so short on time, I'm looking for like a one-word, 30-second answer. What do you see as the greatest challenge to deepening engagement among the three nations? Let's go in reverse order. So, Jake, what is the greatest challenge for security cooperation moving forward?
I think the greatest challenge is going to be something like the integration that you mentioned earlier. I would say even in the longer term, it's more about trading notes about how to integrate their own air and missile defenses rather than put them together. But a lot of those kinds of technical issues are going to be really difficult, especially if some of the underlying political improvements don't end up being durable.
Makes sense to me. All right, Hannah, what do you see on the tech side?
I think one of the greatest challenges is actually a challenge that we're all facing in tech policy right now, which is that supply chains are messy. Fixing them is messy because it requires coming together to prioritize different nodes or capabilities, either in your state or in another state if that's more strategic. And those conversations are really, really difficult, especially if there is sort of political baggage or, other sorts of historical baggage hanging in the balance. Making those tough decisions to prioritize someone else's capability over your own for the greater good of the supply chain writ large is just difficult. So I think that's going to be a big challenge, especially given some of their complementary but also competing capabilities.
So Josh, what do you see on the political side?
I think that ultimately it boils down to the longevity of these trends. The foundation of cooperation is the level of strategic alignment. And we're seeing an unprecedented level of that strategic alignment right now within the trilateral relationship. But the degree to which this progress will be sustainable is dependent on the degree to which these ideas are independent of any particular leader. And instead a representation of the shared values of the countries themselves and the peoples that live in them. And like I said, the fact that all three countries are democracies mean that the leaders will change. So that's just an inevitability that we have to prepare for.
Well, I think that is all we have time for today because I promised we would be done on time, in part because even though we want to talk more about opportunities and challenges here, we have the pitch coming up, and this is the continuation of the annual conference. I was lucky enough to judge an earlier round of the pitch, so I've heard some of the contestants' pitches before. You don't want to miss this. So we're going to take a short commercial break, if you will, and we'll be right back. So continue to tune in on cnas.org/live and follow along for the pitch. Thanks for tuning in, folks.